Okay, everyone, welcome to our Intro to Psychology course. And our third week of class, we will be discussing consciousness, which comes from chapter 10. So, yes, we are going slightly out of order this week, but we will be discussing chapter 10 because your sleep assignment is actually due this week as well. Okay, so when we talk about consciousness, we're talking about a process of awareness, and then we're going to talk about some unconscious processes as well, what that actually means, what the operational definition is, how we measure it, and concepts related to sleep. Okay, so let's talk about how we actually measure consciousness. Well, many years ago, a long time ago, psychologists used to, have this idea of consciousness, and then it kind of changed into something else. They kind of started studying it, but found it difficult to study, and as a result, they abandoned it. And then in recent years, they have now picked up more research. On consciousness. So let's talk about what an operational definition of consciousness is. Now, remember, what we talked about in a prior chapter is that an operational definition is one that tells how we measure something, but doesn't actually tell what that concept is. It's just how we're going to measure it. Okay. So for consciousness, the operational definition talks about a cooperative person reports being conscious or aware. There's a good word to think of when you think of consciousness is awareness of one stimulus and not of another. Then he or she was conscious of the first and not the second, meaning stimuli. Okay. So there's limited research questions when it comes to consciousness because so many of those questions are hard to answer. So we can only ask ones that we can get an answer to. That's why the research when it comes to consciousness is somewhat limited. So, for example, one of the questions that we should be able to get an answer to as a research question related to consciousness would be, how does the brain activity when someone is conscious of a stimulus differ from the activity when someone is not conscious of the same or similar stimulus? Seems like an intricate question, but we can actually research and get an answer because we can measure the brain activity of someone to show a different scan of someone conscious of something and someone not conscious of the same stimulus. We can see an actual picture on a brain scan. So that's why they use different methods of measuring the brain activity, such as an EEG or an MEG. They put detectors on someone's scalp to help measure the changes in activity. And then we get these visual pictures of the brain with, let's say, different colorings on the scans that can show us the areas of the brain that are being activated and where consciousness takes place and doesn't take place. Okay, so we actually can do that kind of research, but the other kinds of research is a bit limited when it comes to consciousness. Okay, there are a few ways of controlling how aware or conscious someone is of a stimulus. So there's three of them. Let's talk about each one. The first one is called masking, is where before or after a stimulus with some type of pattern, you know, it might actually prevent the person from being conscious of it if something interferes with it. So picture a picture of an empty box, and then the next box on the paper has a word in it, and then the next box after that is an empty box again. So we look and see a box that's empty. We are conscious of an empty box. Then we see another box that has a word written in it, and the word kind of evokes some sort of visual picture for us. And then a flash of another empty box happens, but we have become conscious of that second box that had a word that evoked some visual imagery for us. And as a result, even though the third box is empty that we're seeing on a screen, we still have in our head the conscious picture of whatever that word was in the second box. Okay, so that's what masking is. The second way of controlling consciousness of a stimulus is called flash suppression. This procedure. It blocks the consciousness of a stationary stimulus and surrounds it by rapidly flashing other things. Let me give an example, makes it easier. Okay, picture you're looking at a screen and you see a single yellow dot and it's not moving, it's just there in the middle of the screen. And then you start seeing these flashing blue dots going around the yellow dot. Okay, what ends up happening is that you become conscious or aware of only the blue dots that are flashing. The yellow dot that's stationary in the middle of all the flashing dots, you are not conscious of anymore that it's actually there. Okay, that's what flash suppression means. Okay, and then we have something called binocular rivalry. Okay, think about when you look through binoculars. You have both eyes looking through the binoculars, and you see a picture in front of you, right? However, when we talk about rivalry, we're talking about a competition between a left and a right side of something, okay? In this case, of your eyes seeing something. So picture a circle with lines going up and down, and then a circle with lines going side to side in it. When you have binocular rivalry, we kind of alternate between seeing the pattern on the left of the circle with the lines going up and down, and then the circle on the right with the lines going side to side. The brain alternates between seeing one or the other. We cannot see both of them at once. Our consciousness becomes focused on only one side at a time. That's what binocular rivalry is. Okay, there's a bit more of these pictures that I was just describing are in the textbook if you look in the chapter. Okay, when we talk about brain activity, do we consider that conscious or unconscious? Well, let's talk about a few things. When someone is conscious, and you might want to write the word aware above conscious, it'll give you another word to think of as to really what we're talking about when we're talking about conscious activity. It's awareness of a stimulus. Then the following things occur. Well, when we are actively aware or conscious of something, it's going to kind of fire up or activate the neurons in our brain more strongly. Remember neurons from our biology chapter as those things in the brain that kind of transmit the messages. And if we have a stimulus that we're actively conscious of, then those neurons kind of get fired up even more. Okay. And as a result, then, because they're fired up, they kind of start to reverberate. Think of move around quickly into other brain areas. Okay, they go throughout many brain areas. They don't just stay in the one area that the neurons have fired up. They kind of just start spreading out into other areas, and then the activity then rebounds. Think of a boomerang. When you throw a boomerang and it turns around and comes back, that's what happens here. The activity of those neurons moving around in the brain then kind of sends messages all the way back to the original response that we had to that stimulus. Okay, and then these activation of these neurons often prevents us or inhibits us from seeing other stimuli. Okay, that means that it's often hard for us to be conscious of several things at the same time. Okay, let me give you an example to clarify this. Pretend someone is talking to you while another person might be bouncing a basketball nearby, while another person nearby is jumping up and down. While these are all stimuli, you become conscious, really, and aware of mainly one of them. You can't necessarily be conscious of all of them at the same time. Your neurons kind of activate and fire up, focusing in on one of those things that is going on around you. That's what makes it conscious thought for you. You're conscious to that one stimulus, not all of those things going on around you. Okay, Um, Sometimes, though, we have some unconscious processing going on of things that we haven't focused on, stimuli that we haven't focused on. So, for example, when we are conscious of one stimulus, like the example I just gave you, let's say someone talking to you nearby, but not the person bouncing the basketball or the person jumping up and down, um, then those other two things that we're not conscious of that are going on around us, okay, um, our brain actually processes all of them, but then the brain decides for us which one is the important one that we're focusing on. So think of again, someone's three things are going on around you. Person is talking to you, another is bouncing a basketball nearby, another is jumping up and down. Okay, we are conscious of one of those, one stimulus, such as the person talking, but not of another, not the other two. Okay, those other two, the basketball being bounced and someone else jumping up and down, are unconscious ones. Our brain does that process for us of saying, okay, you're going to be conscious of the person talking, but not of the other two. The talking person is the one that's more important, so you need to be conscious of those. Even though the brain processes the unconscious ones of the person bouncing the ball and the person jumping up and down, they kind of filter that out for us, the brain, and say, hey, you need to focus on, you're conscious of the person talking to you, because that's probably the most important one if someone's talking to you. Okay, it's almost like that background noise thing that you can think of. There's a lot of things going on in the background, but you're focusing on one thing. That's because the brain has made the decision to make that your conscious awareness piece. Okay, all right. The idea that consciousness is all or none is a phenomenon that we agree with. Either the brain activity of those neurons spreads strongly through the brain, or it does not. And what that means is, think I either saw something or I didn't. Let's say if something flashed before me, in front of me, if I was looking at a screen. You can't say I partly saw it or I sort of saw it. You would have to say I either saw it and was conscious of it, or I didn't see it at all. Okay, that's what this all or none phenomenon actually refers to. Okay, consciousness is also thought of as a construction. Now, think of the word construction. Construction has to do with building. All right, when we have a conscious experience of a stimulus, it's a construction that can occur slightly after the stimulus itself rather than at the same time. Let me give you an example. Think something is flashed in front of us for a certain number of seconds, and then we are not conscious to what we saw. If we flash it again longer, we now see it in the second part of the time as our brain constructed it or built upon from the first part and the first time. Let me clarify. So something's flashed in front of us, let's say for 30 seconds. We didn't become conscious of what that was. We weren't aware of it. But then we flash that item in front of us, in front of our view, for let's say 60 seconds. Okay? During the first 30 seconds, we really don't necessarily become conscious of it, but in that second 30 seconds of the 60 seconds, we then have our brain construct what that is and we become conscious of it. Okay, so it kind of built upon us seeing it for 30 seconds the first time, and then the second time when it was flashed for 60 seconds, the first 30 seconds we didn't really again become conscious of it because our brain was doing some sort of construction, but then we did become conscious of it in that second 30 seconds. All right, and what ends up happening is then we apply that to future things that we see. So in the text they give a great example of, first we see two lines, one on top of the other, and then second they show us or flash before us two circles, but they're not exactly lined up one on top of the other. And then third, they show us two lines again. And we see the two lines as not lined up one on top of the other. And that's because in the second flashing, the two circles were not lined up. And that's now constructed in our head as part of our consciousness. So whatever we see after that, we've now applied. Even though the first time we saw the lines, they were lined up. Okay, so if you look in your text, you will see that particular piece with the lines and the circles. It's much easier to view it that way. Okay, all right. We talked about how we use brain measurements, EEGs, MEGs, and why do we need to use them, and how can we use them to infer that consciousness is going on. This gets into the nitty gritty of what we mean by brain activity. And brain activity, the category of brain activity relates to items such as arousal, such as responsiveness to things, whether it's voices or actions, and then presumed consciousness. Do we think that consciousness actually is occurring? So these four items in red, brain death, coma, vegetative state, and minimally conscious state, have to do with activity in the brain, from a kind of least to most, if you think of it, transition. Okay, so the definition of brain death means that the brain shows no activity and no response to any stimulus that is provided to it. Okay, these are often the cases where when someone has, been identified as having brain death, they are removed from life support because there's no activity in the brain and then no response. Remember, those are two different kind of criteria that are used when measuring what's going on in the brain: activity and response. When someone is in a coma, it's a condition where the brain actually shows a very steady but often a low level of activity, okay, which is more so than the first category of brain death. But there's also no response to any stimulus when someone is in a coma. So in this case, oftentimes the person, there's two outcomes of someone in a coma. They often die, or they will recover slowly, after a few weeks, and things then improve, and then they do start showing more steady and more levels of activity in the brain. There is no way to determine which one of these will happen. Okay. Then we have a vegetative state, and often someone in a vegetative state has emerged from a coma, the level before, okay? And this condition is marked by very limited responsiveness to stimuli, where if someone is stimulated by either, a tapping or a sound, they have, let's say, maybe an increased heart rate of some sort. And then we know that that's a limited responsiveness reaction. And there is some brain activity. Okay, so the thing with a vegetative state is that it can last months or it can last years. It's we don't know. Okay, and then we go from a vegetative state to a minimally conscious state, in which someone has brief periods where they can actually have some sort of action, or they can comprehend some sort of speech. So again, they are minimally, the brain has activity, they can respond to things, and they are minimally conscious at times. And again, that particular level is similar to the vegetative state in that it can last for months or years. Okay. We use brain scans, to kind of give us an idea of consciousness in patients who don't seem to be responding to things in their environment, so that we can actually see what kind of activity is going on. And when you see a brain scan, there are a few pictures in the text. There'll be different colorings on the brain that have been measured. Okay, so it's important to kind of just look at those as well. Okay, when we talk about consciousness and its relationship to action, okay, what we're really referring to here is that some people, when they make a conscious decision to, let's say, make a movement, we can see in the brain the activity that's going on when they're making that movement. However, the kind of precursor to that movement actually happened before the actual movement. So, to know what we're talking about with consciousness, let's think about it this way. Most people will be able to tell you the time that they do something. Like if someone says to another person, flex your wrist or wiggle your fingers, okay? We can do that and say, okay, I flexed my wrist and it was 10:05. Okay, we can actually tell the time that we do the action. However, our brain was actively working or making the conscious decision to flex our wrist or wiggle our fingers before we actually did it. However, we don't know the actual time. We can't report the actual time of that conscious decision to wiggle our fingers or flex our wrist. We can only report the time that we did the action. Okay? So it's important to remember that our brain works actively and makes a conscious decision prior to us doing the action, and while we can report the time we do the action, we can't necessarily report the time of the conscious decision to do it, meaning what happened in our brain and when that actually happened. So that's why um, there is some kind of skepticism with measuring the time of an actual conscious decision, because remember, we're not talking about the time you actually do the action, let's say of moving your wrist or wiggling your fingers, but the conscious decision to do that action took place earlier. And how well can we measure that time? Well, some research says that people can report their conscious decision times like accurately. But others kind of are like, not really. No one can really know that. Okay. Um, we can report fairly accurately, the time that, there's some sort of light, sound, or muscle movement. But again, reporting the time that we made, the decision to do that, it's actually very difficult to do and a lot less accurate. Okay. So another example is I kicked my leg at 8 p.m., but my brain activity, my conscious decision to kick my leg started, let's say, a minute earlier, 30 seconds earlier, 5 minutes earlier. We just don't have an answer to that question. That's what makes it, people skeptical of, can we actually measure that time of the conscious decision? Okay. Why do we need, what is the purpose of consciousness? Okay. Well, one possible explanation and point of consciousness, like what's the function of it, is kind of to prepare for something in the future that could be similar to something we've already experienced. For example, um, think if you did something and it didn't go well, would you say to yourself, what could I have done differently? What would have happened? And think, next time, here is what I'll do. So the conscious thinking piece of, that decision to do something, which may or may not have turned out well, will kind of modify our behavior on a future occasion, because we give thought through our questions to, well, didn't go well, what could I have done differently, what would have happened, and here's what I'll do next time. So that's altering our behavior for the next time based on our conscious decision to do something, which we then analyzed and said, hey, how could we make this better? All right. The second part of the chapter is a whole section on sleep and dreams. Very interesting. Things you probably have heard of in your life. And I'm just going to give a few, minor explanations of things, because a lot of this you probably have heard of. The circadian rhythm has to do with your activity and inactivity. And when we say lasting approximately 1 day, we mean a 24-hour period. Okay. The words circa and dies, combined into circadian, came from those Latin roots, and the meaning is about a day. That's where that comes from, the word circadian. Circa and dies are Latin roots, meaning about a day. So when the use of the sun, the rising and setting of the sun, is what kind of gives us are, cues to reset the rhythm. However, the key piece is we often kind of generate this rhythm ourselves with our own schedules. Even though this, rising and setting of the sun should give us kind of that external cue, we have an internal cue that we generate the rhythm in our own way. Okay. So, besides sleeping and waking, when everyone thinks, okay, circadian rhythm just refers to sleeping and waking, it actually controls many other functions. It controls our hunger and thirst, our production of urine, our blood pressure, how alert we are, our body temperature, and our mood. And what's interesting, and an interesting piece about mood, is that most young people, their mood varies over a day, where their peak of happiness is often in the late afternoon. So, if you're a younger person, you tend to be most happy in the late afternoon. I thought that was an interesting little tidbit to share with you there. Okay. Then we have this idea of morning people and evening people. Okay. With the variations of everyone's circadian rhythms, because remember, we talked about on this prior slide that you generate the rhythm yourself. So, since we have variations, some people kind of arouse quickly and reach their peak of how alert they are early on in the day. So those people are considered morning people. So you might want to write morning people next to that first one. And then we have evening people, where their alertness kind of increases more slowly and gradually over the daytime, and they reach their peak kind of alertness in the late afternoon or into the early evening. And those people are known as the evening people. Okay. Most young adults are either evening people or they're intermediate, meaning they kind of fall between the two, whereas most people over 65 are morning people. Okay. So if you think about this and our course in psychology here, we kind of are always trying to talk about behaviors and how things that go on affect behavior. And so I want you to think about the question, what effects does this, knowing you're a morning person or an evening person based on your circadian rhythm, what effect does this have on your everyday life? It has to have some sort of impact. When you do best at work, when you study, if you're a morning person and yet you work the night shift, what could that mean? What implications does that have for your behavior or for your alertness or for your effectiveness? Okay. That's the kind of thing you should start thinking about when connecting these concepts. Okay. Great figure, just kinds of talking about how we can adjust our circadian rhythms a bit and how this works when it involves jet lag. I'm sure you've heard the term jet lag when people fly from different parts of the world to other parts of the world, or one part of our country, let's say, to a different part of our country in particular. Jet lag is known as this period of discomfort when our internal clock, also known as our circadian rhythm, is kind of out of its phase because we're in a new surrounding with a different time. Okay, because we're used to our rhythm being on a time schedule of 24 hours. However, if we travel, sometimes that 24-hour period either gets shortened, depending on the time change, or lengthened, when we travel the first day because of the time difference. Okay, so the thing to remember based on these arrows here going back and forth is that people suffer more serious jet lag when they travel east than when they travel west. So let's think about that. If we are traveling from New York, let's stay within our country, to California, we are traveling west. So it's easier for us to overcome the jet lag because we can just go to bed later to adjust our circadian rhythms, our internal clocks. Okay. However, when we're traveling east, so from California, let's say, to New York, we would have to go to bed earlier to adjust, which actually is a little more challenging. So we suffer a little bit more jet lag when we're doing the traveling east thing. All right, so just interesting. And then the next chart is even more interesting because many people I know work night shifts or work different kind of shift work in various career fields. Okay, and they give you this great chart of how it's easier to adjust if your shift changes than in a different way. So, for example, if you are currently working the midnight to 8 a.m. shift at your job, it's easier to adjust your circadian rhythm if the next 2 weeks, let's say you work the 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. shift. So that's why that arrow is right here is going from left to right, from this one shift to the other. Then let's say you work this 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. shift for a few weeks, and then your shift changes again, as it often does in shift work. It's easier for your body to adjust the circadian rhythms and the internal clocks to working the 4 p.m. to midnight shift. Okay, these are the easier kinds of adjustments. All right. However, if you start, let's say, working the 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. shift, and your boss says, okay, I want you to start working the midnight to 8 a.m. shift, that's going to be harder to adjust. It's almost like the traveling, okay, if we go from here to here, the traveling east thing. Okay, so we're going from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., and then we're told in 2 weeks we're going to shift to the midnight to 8 a.m. shift. That's actually harder to go from this middle one over, all right, because it's like traveling east with the jet lag, all right. The direction is kind of critical when we talk about going forward or going backwards. So that's an interesting chart, especially those of you that do shift work. I'm sure you find that interesting. And if anyone actually does any shift work and would like to share with the class, and that they find this to be correct, please do that. Okay. When we talk about brain mechanisms and circadian rhythms, there's an area of the brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is a little piece in the brain that generates this rhythm. Okay. The sunlight, when we talked about sun, the light and dark thing, sunlight doesn't necessarily generate the rhythm, but it does kind of help to reset the button, to reset the switch. Think of it that way. Okay. So it helps when people, get sunlight if they're not used to being awake during the day, or have it really dark if they need to be sleeping when it's not necessarily dark. See, like sunlight plays like that pivotal role in helping to reset the rhythm in a way, so we can use that. The suprachiasmatic nucleus kind of, the control it has, the purpose it has, is to regulate what we call the pineal gland's secretions of a hormone. The hormone is known as melatonin. I know this is a term that many of you have heard or seen because you take it as a supplement sometimes at night if you're having trouble sleeping. Some people do this, especially those that travel to different time zones. Because what happens is this pineal gland is usually starts releasing the hormone which is naturally occurring in our body called melatonin for about 2 to 3 hours before bedtime is when the start of the release of melatonin happens. Okay, and the pineal gland is the one that actually releases the melatonin, and the suprachiasmatic nucleus is what tells the pineal gland to release that hormone melatonin. Okay, so if you're flying east, remember from California to New York, and your circadian rhythm is harder to adjust, remember going east, oftentimes people who do that kind of traveling will take that melatonin supplement to help with this. Someone who is not traveling, between time zones, for example, and is taking melatonin, let's say like right before they go to sleep, it won't do much because the pineal gland should have already started releasing that melatonin naturally 2 to 3 hours before bedtime. Okay, so I know that a lot of times people take melatonin before bed to help them sleep, but it's more about not that your gland did not secrete it, but that it maybe didn't secrete enough of it, if you think about it that way. Okay, so that's an important piece to remember with melatonin because I'm sure many of you have heard that. Why we sleep. Okay, what's the purpose of sleep? I know some of you are like, I don't need sleep. I don't want to sleep. I want to live my life. Okay, but we do need sleep. There are several really important critical functions. The first one is to conserve some energy. We have to save energy. You can't continue to exert energy without saving some energy because energy that we save is needed to regenerate so many things and rest so many organs and body systems that need that little bit of a rest. Okay. And another important function to sleep is that it can actually give us an opportunity to make our learning and our memory stronger. And those are kind of really key things. Okay, so let's talk about the learning and memory piece. When we learn, learning can improve if memory improves if sleeping within 3 hours. If you go to sleep, if you try to learn something, right, and then you go to sleep, all right. If it's 3 hours, if it's within 3 hours of you learning something new and then you go to sleep, that will improve your memory of what you learned. So if you, let's say, are studying something at 8 p.m. at night, and then you go to bed at 10 o'clock at night, okay, that is a good way to learn because that will now, your memory of what you learned will improve. However, if you try to learn something, let's say at 8 o'clock at night, and you don't go to sleep until 1 o'clock in the morning, well, it's not as effective. Your memory, it's not as effective. Your memory won't necessarily hold on to as much of what you learned. Okay. So these ideas really, kind of uh, support the idea of don't pull all night study sessions because they don't necessarily work based on this idea of learning something and then having your memory improve if you go to sleep within 3 hours of learning that material. Okay. Um, in addition, if you get the sleep that you need, it improves learning for the next day as well. Like when you're learning something the next day, when after you awake, that also improves. So sleep is really a critical piece. When people are sleep deprived, they really have difficulty maintaining attention. They are often more vulnerable to physical and mental illness. And we often talk about how sleep deprived drivers are as dangerous as drunk drivers. I don't know if any of you have newer cars that have those signals in them that tell people, hey, you should take a break. Like they sense if someone's like maybe weaving or not driving straight. They give these messages to people now, like, hey, take a break. And, you seem to be weaving or you seem to be, um, not alert enough. Okay, there are cars that actually have these features now. Let's talk about some of the stages of sleep. We have something called the rapid eye movement or REM sleep, a term you probably have heard. This is where, and the next slide is going to show you the different stages. But at this stage, what's happening is the eyes are having these rapid movements under your closed eyelids, of course, because you are sleeping. There's a lot of brain activity going, a very kind of almost frenetic pace of brain activity. There's the muscles are very relaxed. But it's also known as paradoxical sleep because it's light and deep. It's light in that light sleep because the brain is very active and the heart and breathing temperatures fluctuate, okay? But it's very deep sleep because your muscles, your large muscles, are extremely, extremely relaxed, okay? Dreams are common in REM sleep, but that's not the only time we have dreams. So let's take a look at the next slide because it has some great charts on here. Various stages that people go through throughout the night, okay? The blue little lines on each of the boxes, in each of the boxes is the brain waves. And then the red line is the typical eye movement. So when we look at the first box, this is when you're relaxed and awake, typically what we can measure and see for eye movements and brain waves. Then we go to stage 1 sleep where you've just fallen asleep. Your neurons are kind of the activity that they're kind of firing up and not. It's very unsynchronized. There's no real exact pattern to it. But this stage, the stage 1 sleep right here, is the closest thing to resemble REM sleep, except that it doesn't have the rapid eye movement. So when we talk about stage 1 sleep here, it's the brain waves are very close to the REM stage, which is down here in number F or letter F, but the rapid eye movements is what's different. See how this line is relatively straight, very unsynchronized, some blips up, some straight across, but in REM sleep, as you can see from the eye movements, that red line is all over the place. Okay, so then we have stage 1 sleep. And then we have stage 2 sleep, where pulse and breathing slow down. We start to have longer brain waves. If you notice, there's just slightly more kinds of higher ups in the brain waves. And then that's still non-REM sleep. Then we get to stage 3 and 4. 3 and 4 both still non-REM. Stage 3, pulse, breathing slow down, brain activity slows down even more. As you notice, the waves get higher, slowing it down a bit, not as intense or, active. Um, there's more synchronization. You start seeing these up and down kinds of patterns. And then stages 3 and 4 here are often during the first half of the night. Okay. And then stage 4, again, slowest brain activity, slowest pulse and breathing. Notice there's space between these ups and downs in the brain activity. And then the brain waves are more highly synchronized as well as to the ups and downs, meaning there's very few neurons that are firing up at this time. Okay. And then you get to REM sleep, where the eyes are moving back and forth. You see this very jagged eye movement. That's what we talked about. Dreams are more frequent. The brain waves are kind of desynchronized completely. Most relaxed muscles, and the duration gets longer toward morning. Now let's talk about timing. Okay. Usually stages 2, 3, and 4 last about 90 to 100 minutes. And then what ends up happening during the night is we fall asleep. We go through stages 2, 3, and 4. And then we go back to 3 and 2. And then we enter REM sleep. So think of it as a 2, 3, 4, back, 3, 2, and then REM. That's the tendency has, and it just keeps repeating throughout the night. So just something to keep in mind with the timing. These are great charts to really kind of explain things. All right. And remember, REM sleep is very similar to stage 1 sleep. Okay. Insomnia is when we're not getting enough sleep to feel rested. Okay. Well, 6 hours is kind of the average. But again, 6 hours may be okay for one person, but maybe not for another. And there's lots of causes for insomnia. Noise in the room, wherever you're trying to sleep, worries about something, indigestion or, stomach issues, uncomfortable temperatures, using alcohol or caffeine, having that in your system, or having any medical or psychological disorders. If insomnia persists, then you really do need to see a doctor. If, however, it's minor, meaning, you're having a really bad week because you have a lot of tests or things due, for example, then you maybe want to try other things first, because it may not become a persistent problem. It may be temporary. All right. Some of the things you should try if you're having some minor insomnia is, keeping to a regular, bedtime and waking up schedule, keeping your room cool, exercising. But the key to exercise is not within a few hours of bedtime. That actually will work in reverse. Okay. Avoiding stimulants like caffeine and things. And then, of course, getting some sunlight, let's say, during the day will help to keep your circadian rhythm kind of in balance. And then the insomnia should correct itself and get better. Okay. There are some other more serious sleep conditions. One is called sleep apnea. This is where someone fails to breathe for a minute or so during sleep and kind of wakes up gasping for breath. Oftentimes, this condition is more common in overweight middle-aged men, because the breathing passages become very narrow, which is part of it. And so the treatment for sleep apnea is often the recommendation to lose weight, or people with sleep apnea often wear these masks that pump air to keep the passages open and breath flowing, the way it should be. All right. A second condition, a pretty serious condition for sleep, has to do with a term called narcolepsy, which is where a person has a sudden attack of sleepiness. Again, whether they have gotten enough sleep at night or not has no effect on this. This has to do with some people with narcolepsy lose some brain cells that produce something called orexin, which is a neurotransmitter. And that neurotransmitter sends the message to someone, hey, stay awake. If that if that neurotransmitter orexin does not get produced, then that's when people experience narcolepsy. Okay, so and a treatment for narcolepsy is the use of some stimulant drugs to, keep the brain cells that produce that neurotransmitter, working. Okay, other sleep experiences that people have: sleep talking. This sleep talking, when you talk in your sleep, it's most common in stage two, but it can occur in all the stages that we just talked about on the other slide. But it's most common in stage two. There really is nothing to worry about with sleep talking. Usually, people, don't say some, deep inner things that other people will hear. So it's nothing to, be as concerned about as some of the other kind of sleep experiences. Sleepwalking mainly occurs in children and during the stage four of sleep. Um, some adults sleepwalk as well. During the first half of the night is usually when someone will sleepwalk. And I know some of you may have heard that you shouldn't wake up a sleepwalker, but that doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily true. You really should guide the person kind of gently back into wherever they were sleeping, as a safety, as precaution for safety. Obviously, we would want them to get hurt while they were sleepwalking, but that's the best advice for, helping a sleepwalker. Okay, lucid dreaming, what that refers to is that part of the brain is actually awake and part is asleep. The person's fully aware that it is a dream that they are having. That's what the term lucid means. It's clear to them that they are dreaming, but it has to do with, part of the brain awake, part asleep. Then we have something called a periodic limb movement disorder. This is where there's this pleasant sensation in the legs where the movements of the legs are repetitive and they move kind of constantly enough to interrupt someone's sleep. This isn't those movements where, when you're about to fall asleep and, your knee will jerk or your arm will, pop up or something. That's not what we're talking about here. These are kind of more intense and very unpleasant kinds of feelings, and they go on and on, so they interrupt sleep. Traditionally, this does happen mainly in over age 50 people. The causes are unknown, so it's kind of an interesting thing just to be aware of. Night terrors are pretty serious conditions. Someone wakes up screaming and sweating, their heart is racing, sometimes their arms are flailing. This usually occurs during stage 3 or 4. It does not occur in REM sleep. The dreams that people are having during night terrors usually have a single image as their focus. Usually, night terrors occur in children mainly, but some reports of adults having night terrors have also occurred. Okay. When we talk about dreams, there are lots of descriptive studies that kind of try to describe dreams and what they mean and are they symbolic and so on and so forth. But here's some basic information, some descriptive things about dreams in general. More dreams are threatening dreams than pleasant dreams. A good example is usually around 11 to 13-year-olds have the happiest dreams in that age group. After that time, dreams tend to get worse over time, meaning threatening and less pleasant. Most dreams are similar to what we think about in everyday life, okay? However, we don't dream about everything we do in daily life. So even though we think about our life in a dream, let's say, we don't think about concerns like reading, writing, or using a computer, for example, which is our daily life. We may think about in our dreams other things, okay, but not like our daily activities of reading, writing, or using a computer, let's say, okay. Then there's always been the interesting piece of whether or not blind people have dreams. And there's two ways of, you have to remember two things about this, and that it really does depend on the age they lost their eyesight. So if someone is born blind, when they dream, they do not have any visual imagery in their dreams. Their dreams only consist of sounds, touch, smells, and tastes. Whereas if someone had their sight at birth but experienced eye damage after, let's say, ages 5 to 7, they will still have some visual dreams, but over time, those visual dreams will eventually decline. Okay. Freud is brought up in this chapter. about his theory of dreams. But just so you know, just a couple of terms here. His theory of dreams has been on the decline. We don't necessarily use it for much explanation of dreams anymore. It's not as popular now. Two parts of content have to do with manifest and latent. These two ideas of content were used to try to probe for hidden meanings in dreams, which are kind of needed to try to understand them. But they're not thought of anymore as being that important in trying to analyze dreams. So, manifest content being something that appears to be just on the surface of a dream, or latent content, which, according to Freud, is these hidden ideas, in the dream that can represent something symbolically. Okay. And you probably have heard those things, but I don't want to spend too much time on Freud because, again, his ideas are not necessarily ones that, are readily acceptable today. We have more modern theories of dreaming. Let's talk about those. Okay. The first one, you might want to put a one next to the activation synthesis theory of dreams. This is where, the part of the brain called the cortex takes some sort of activity that happens during REM sleep, plus whatever stimuli kind of hits our senses, and then kind of tries to make sense of it. So, what this has to do, I'm going to give you an example, makes it easier. If you are dreaming of using a toilet or trying to find one, you often awaken to discover that you really do need to use the toilet. Okay, so that's a good example to remember with activation synthesis theory of dreams. It's kind of what we call a bottom up approach, where we have these sensory feelings, and then they take us up to thinking through something. Okay, whereas the alternate view, the next one, you might want to put a number two next to it, is known as the neurocognitive theory. And it's simply a kind of thinking where, similar to where we like daydream or mind wander, we actually are conscious of our thinking. And it's more like a top down, where we think first and then we have some sort of sensory input kind of working with our thinking. So, a couple of things to remember here, in that there are certain conditions that lead to this neurocognitive theory of dreaming, where we actually have less sensory stimulation going on. We have reduced activity in the part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. Okay, we often have a loss of, voluntarily thinking of our thinking, controlling our thinking. And then there's enough things going on, enough activity going on in other areas of our brain, where more things can be happening in the dream at once. Okay, so just some ideas related to the modern theories for dreaming. All right, the last module talks about hypnosis, always an interesting one. The word hypnos, hypnos, comes from the from Greek, and it's actually, hypnos is the Greek god of sleep. So that's where the idea of hypnosis, the word, came from. And the strict definition of hypnosis is a condition of focused attention and kind of increased suggestibility, where a person and the subject kind of have this relationship of, I suggest something and you're focused enough on it. That's where the relationship comes in. So it started with a person named Mesmer, who was an Austrian, and he used to treat illnesses by taking a magnet and kind of passing it over the body of the person. Then he would remove the magnet and use his hands to kind of just hover his hands over a person's body to try to treat their illnesses. He believed that it was that he was the magnet when he went to move his hands over the people that treated their illnesses. Just a little tidbit, it actually led to the term called animal magnetism, which then eventually was called hypnotism. However, it was kind of thought to be really like not a real thing. Okay, it was kind of thought to be fake, this idea of hypnotism. Lots of times we have illusionists using hypnotism or people to entertain, but the only real legitimate use of hypnosis is by a licensed therapist. And we do have licensed therapists who do practice hypnotism. There's ways of inducing hypnosis. However, the key is this repeating of suggestions. But the person who's trying to be hypnotized needs to be cooperative and willing. That's kind of the key, because you can't hypnotize an uncooperative person. It just won't work. Okay. So I'm going to read off to you kind of a sample script of what a hypnotist might actually try to do when they're repeating suggestions to start. Okay. So they might repeat monotonously in a very monotonous kind of tone. You are putting everything else out of your mind except what you hear from me. You are starting to fall asleep. Your eyelids are getting heavy. Your eyelids are getting very heavy. They are starting to close. You are falling into a deep, deep sleep. Okay. Then a bit later, they might, the hypnotist might suggest something specific like, after you go under hypnosis, your arm will begin to rise automatically. And if someone shoots their arm up, the hypnotist would actually say to them, no, not yet, just relax. That will happen later. And then they have to get into the relaxation. But again, the hypnotized person has to be cooperative and willing, or hypnosis does not work. Okay. We have some uses of hypnosis, what it can and can't do. Okay. We have found one of the effects, well established, is to inhibit pain. Hypnosis can help with sudden, kind of immediate pain, but it can also help with chronic pain. One of the positive things about hypnosis is that it can do this without any side effects, such as, when we use a drug for something, there's always a side effect. With hypnosis, there isn't. However, most doctors and hospitals don't use hypnosis as a way to inhibit pain. So, something just to think about. Another use of hypnosis is what's called the post hypnotic suggestion. And what this is that the suggestion is for someone to do or experience something after they come out of the hypnosis. For example, we want to help someone break an unwanted habit such as smoking. So the suggestion during the hypnotic experience would be, after they come out of it, to not smoke. There have been studies to support this, but unfortunately only very, very limited and few studies. So not a whole ton of research for people to kind of be on board with this, but there have been some studies. What hypnosis cannot do or does not do, it doesn't give people any special powers or unusual kind of powers or special strengths. It doesn't improve your memory accuracy. Let's say someone wants to use hypnosis to get a person to remember details of a crime that they might have witnessed. Okay, so a lot of times we use this in criminal justice. People think this can help. But it doesn't improve memories, because when someone is asked to report their memories when they're under hypnosis, they often give correct and incorrect information, and yet they seem very confident of that, yet the information is not always correct. They have what we call an illusion of memory. An illusion of memory. That means they have this idea that they remember everything when they're under hypnosis, but it really is not correct information all the time. Okay? And is this, going back to the general idea of this chapter and the whole concept of consciousness, is hypnosis kind of a different state of what we call consciousness? Is it a special state of consciousness? Is it a wakeful consciousness? It's not greatly different from what we normally see as being awake, but it's also not someone just pretending either. So it kind of is like a middle ground, okay? The problem is that people who pretend to be hypnotized can actually, mimic any effect, that hypnosis has them doing. Okay. However, the pretenders, those who are pretending to be hypnotized, actually learn to imitate something. But for people who are truly hypnotized, whatever action happens spontaneously. They didn't learn it, they didn't kind of pretend or mimic it, it just happens. So there is a slight difference between, someone pretending to be hypnotized and someone who truly is hypnotized. Okay. And then the last slide takes us into the last couple of other states. Like we just talked about, maybe hypnosis is another state of consciousness, but two other states: meditation, which is kind of a procedure where someone really is in a calm, relaxed state using special techniques. Other ideas behind meditation include mindfulness. So think of the M in meditation, as well as the word mindfulness also begins with an M. This is where you have feelings and sensations, but you don't have thoughts. So you're aware of, let's say, wind hitting your face, or you're aware of maybe something touching your arm, but you have no thought process or awareness of any thoughts at the time you are meditating or in a mindfulness state. Okay. So that's, and of course there's very positive effects of meditation: relaxation, decreasing anxiety, and enhancing attention. And then we have something called the deja vu experience, where you say, hey, I feel like I've seen that before, done that before. It's very common in young adults, but less common as people grow older. And we've had some research and shown there's some brain scans that we can see, where when there's a deja vu experience, it relates to some abnormal activity in the brain areas. Um, it's almost like, you remember that movie Groundhog Day? If anyone ever saw it, it's a long time ago. I think it was an 80s movie, where Bill Murray keeps waking up in the same day and he keeps repeating the same thing every day. He goes, this has happened before, or I've been at this day before. So it's that kind of thing. And is that really consciousness? Or again, is it some other thing related to just a memory we're having? Is it just familiarity with an experience? Something we're experiencing today is like something, or is it exactly the same as what we experienced before? So, all kinds of good questions, just other ideas behind other states of consciousness. So, okay. Hope that gave you a good overview of the chapter. Please make sure you read the chapter, and I will see you in class.